There was something that the native peoples of the American Northeast knew about survival that modern engineering took centuries to understand. It wasn't a secret, no. It was magic, it was physics, it was geometry, a relationship with wood, wind, and cold that few civilizations in the world cultivated with such precision. If this kind of knowledge is part of the world you want to explore, consider following this channel. Here, forgotten ancient solutions are brought back, not as historical curiosities, but as real alternatives to what modernity has sold us. When winter arrived in the northeastern American continent, with cutting winds descending from Canada and temperatures plunging below -40 degrees, the Haudenosaunee people, known to European colonizers as the Iroquois, did not shiver inside makeshift huts. They lived in structures that held 30, 50, sometimes 100 people, structures that lasted for decades, structures that regulated temperature passively, without metal, without glass, without fossil fuel, structures called longhouses. The image that common sense created about North American indigenous housing is almost always the same. The conical tent, the central fire, the cramped space. It's an image that reduces centuries of architectural sophistication to a transient aesthetic. Nomadic peoples of the plains used teepees because they needed to move. The Haudenosaunee were not nomadic. They were farmers. Diplomats, engineers, and their longhouses were the physical expression of a civilization that had solved the problem using wood and tree bark, a problem that still challenges designers in extreme climates today. How to keep a living space habitable when the world outside tries to kill everything that breathes as its first order of business. What the Europeans did not understand upon seeing these structures was the proportion. A typical longhouse was between 20 and 40 meters long, but only 6 to 8 meters wide. This disproportion was not aesthetic. It was aerodynamic. A long, narrow structure offers much less wind resistance than a square or circular structure of the same area. The wind howls along the sides. It doesn't find a flat face to push against. It slides off. The second element that went unnoticed was the shape. The roof was not flat. It was arched, convex, with precise curvature built on bent wood arches. That arch was not decorative. It was structural in the fullest sense of the word. It distributes the snow load, which in the American Northeast can exceed 70 centimeters of accumulation, laterally along the length of the structure, instead of concentrating it in the center. A flat roof collapses under pressure. An arched roof strengthens the basic structure. It was built from young, flexible wood poles, young oak, buried in pairs. Parallel along the length of the dwelling, each pair was bent towards the center, and tied at the top with twisted plant fibers or leather strips. Horizontal poles were fitted along the length, creating a grid that distributed the force across the entire surface. The result was a kind of giant rib, like the rib cage of a huge animal, with the flexibility of something alive and the strength of something built. To last over this structure came the covering, and here was the second great insight. What really confused visitors who didn't know how to look carefully. The covering was made of red elm bark, or sometimes other local species available, cut into large sheets and overlapped like fish scales from the base to the top. The geometry of the overlap solved the problem. Water found no way in because the structure left no space for it to seep through. But what this covering did, besides repelling rain, was equally remarkable. It breathed. Tree bark, by its nature, is impermeable to liquid water, but permeable to water vapor. That meant the moisture generated by dozens of breathing bodies inside the longhouse could escape without forced ventilation, without windows. The wall itself was a moisture management system. In extremely cold climates, indoor humidity is as serious a problem as the cold itself. Air saturated with vapor transfers heat from the body much more efficiently than dry air. Controlling humidity was controlling comfort. The eggshell did this passively inside. The arrangement of space followed a logic that no coincidence could explain. Along the entire length of the longhouse, wooden platforms were built raised about half a meter above the ground. Above ground level, on these platforms, families slept, stored their belongings, and lived below them. The empty space functioned as an air insulator. The bare ground was the coldest surface in any environment. Contact with it during winter nights drains body heat with frightening speed. The platforms eliminated that contact, creating an air chamber that cushioned the temperature difference between the frozen floor and the living space. The inhabited space was in the center of the longhouse, along its longitudinal axis. A series of regularly spaced fires, not a single central fire, but several distributed so that each family had access to heat, without relying on a single source. If one fire went out during the night, others continued. And above each fire, a narrow controllable opening in the roof allowed smoke to escape. These openings were the solution to the most difficult problem of cold climate housing: ventilation without heat loss. An opening too large lets cold in. An opening too small suffocates the inhabitants with smoke. The builders of the longhouses developed over generations a precise reading of the balance between these two extremes. The openings were protected by skins or bark that could be adjusted according to wind direction, cold intensity, amount of smoke produced. They were, in essence, hand-controlled valves operated by people who spent their entire lives learning to read the behavior of air. The smoke rose, carrying excess moisture with it. The warm air remained in the upper part of the interior, where people were not. The raised platforms positioned human bodies exactly in the most stable temperature band, below the smoke layer and a hand's span above the ground. The cold was not an accident. It was accumulated precision. There is another element rarely mentioned when talking about longhouses, but it may be the most ingenious of all: the thermal mass of the people themselves, 50 human bodies at rest. They collectively release the equivalent of several kilowatts of continuous heat. The longhouse was not only heated by the fires, it was heated by the inhabitants themselves. The structure was sized so that this body heat was relevant, not negligible. The colder it was, the more people remained inside, reinforcing the system. It was an architecture that integrated the occupants as a thermal component, not just as passive users. The double walls, when used, created air chambers that functioned as additional insulation. The space between the inner and outer wall was sometimes filled with dry bark, moss, or other plant materials, not for aesthetics but for physics. Still air is one of the best natural insulators. The plant materials trapped the air and prevented its circulation. They turned a layer of a few centimeters into a barrier that resisted heat transfer with surprising efficiency. Engineers designing low-energy walls in the 21st century used the same principle, now called an insulating air cavity. The Haudenosaunee achieved that without equations, thermometers, or simulation programs. They achieved it through the slowest and most reliable method: observation passed down over generations, refined by pressure. Relentless winters that did not forgive mistakes. The longhouse was not just a dwelling, it was an institution. Each structure belonged to a matrilineal clan governed by the eldest women, the matriarchs. They made decisions about who lived there, how the space was organized, which resources were shared. The architecture reflected and reinforced this social structure. The space was communal but organized. There were clear boundaries within the shared environment, marked by poles, hides, baskets, and the geometry of the platform arrangement. The density of people per square meter was calculated not just for social comfort but for collective thermal survival. Too few and body heat was insufficient. Too many and humidity and carbon monoxide made the air unbreathable. The number of inhabitants in a longhouse was, in practice, an engineering decision, even if those who made it never thought of it that way. When winter truly arrived, that January winter in the American Northeast, with winds descending from the Canadian tundra making trees crack, the longhouses entered a different regime. The roof openings were reduced to the necessary minimum, and the entrances were protected by vestibules created by curved extensions of the structure itself. These forced the wind to bend before reaching the inner door. The fires were fed continuously but controlled, dense, slow-burning wood. This produced steady heat without spikes that would quickly consume the stock. People stayed close, and stories were told. The social networks that stitched the community together were reinforced precisely at the moment when physical isolation from the outside world was most complete. The longhouse solved winter not only physically but psychologically. It brought together instead of separating. It transformed the threat of cold into an occasion for cohesion. Meanwhile, 3,000 kilometers away, European colonists were dying of cold inside poorly sealed cabins. They did not understand that the continent they called inhospitable had already been domesticated with surgical precision by those who had inhabited it for centuries. Today, most people live in structures that depend entirely on external systems. For instance, when electricity fails, heating stops. When heating stops at 40 degrees below zero, the time to danger is measured in hours. The Haudenosaunee longhouses functioned without any of these dependencies. They were self-sufficient systems, calibrated to the specific environment where they existed and capable of sustaining human life in the harshest conditions of the American Northeast without failing. This is not nostalgia. It is an engineering question that has not yet been satisfactorily answered. What did we lose when we decided that technology was enough and stopped learning from what came before it? That knowledge did not completely disappear. It is documented, studied, admired, but rarely integrated, rarely taken seriously as a practical answer to the problems we face. If Howards and Zanes had access to modern tools, but maintained an understanding that a structure should work in harmony with its environment and not against it, what would they have built? And we who have all the tools and have forgotten the principles, what are we building? The answer might be worth more than any technology we can invent. If you want to keep thinking about this, here is the right place. Each video brings a fragment of wisdom, that time almost erased, but that still has much to say to today's world.